Entire civilizations disappeared in a single generation. That's the Late Bronze Age collapse. It's blamed on these marauders, the sea peoples. There's an Egyptian inscription. It says the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands, and then all at once the lands were removed, scattered in the fray. So you have this perfect storm. Invasion, rebellion, climate disaster. It shattered a globalized world, and our own world was forged from those ashes. The Hittite Empire vanished, just gone. Egypt barely survived, and you have to ask, who were these sea peoples? Were they destroyers, or were they desperate refugees? The collapse of a world like that. It makes you think about fragility, our own fragility. That Bronze Age world, it was all connected, a kind of delicate web. Around 1200 BC, the Mediterranean wasn't just separate kingdoms. It was more like a network. You had these great empires, the Egyptians, the Hittites over in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece. They weren't just neighbors. They were partners. They'd trade tin from Afghanistan for copper from Cyprus to make bronze. They sent letters, clay tablets, sealed up, talking about marriage alliances, shipments of grain, shipments of gold. Historians have a name for it, the Club of the Great Powers, and we have the proof, the Amarna letters found in Egypt, kings writing to each other, a mix of flattery, demands, gossip. It feels familiar. It was a globalized system long before that word existed, and its heartbeat was trade. The palaces, they controlled these huge economies. Scribes tracking every jar of olive oil, every ingot of metal, every bolt of cloth. And these goods, they didn't just go from A to B. They flowed along routes connecting the Aegean to the Levant, Anatolia to the Nile Delta. That interdependence, it created incredible wealth, cultural exchange, but it also created a deep vulnerability. The whole system functioned like a chain. Every link was essential. If one link broke, the strain would travel down the line. Stability relied on predictable harvests, secure shipping lanes, the authority of the central palaces managing it all. Archaeologist Eric Klein, he describes the Late Bronze Age as a house of cards, beautiful, complex, but built on a shaky table. It was a world of immense achievement, unaware the table was about to be struck. And when it was, the whole house came down in a single, chaotic generation. That shock, the collapse, it's what makes the arrival of the sea peoples so transformative. They didn't emerge in a vacuum. They strode onto a stage that was already beginning to tremble. The walls at Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile. That's Ramesses III's mortuary temple, and across the stone he had them carve the crisis of his reign. You see them there, not as some vague force, but as figures. In a struggle, the detail is something. Egyptian warships, sleek, packed with archers, they ram into these high-prowed enemy vessels. Men tumble into the water. And on land, the pharaoh, a giant compared to the rest, he draws his bow. Against this disorganized mass, warriors, families, you look closer, ox carts piled high with possessions. Pulled by weary animals, women and children are there too, so it's not just an invasion fleet, it's a migration. In arms, this temple is our most important visual source for the whole event. But it's not a documentary, it's a monument to royal power, meant to last, proclaiming that Ramesses saved Egypt from the abyss. To understand the sea peoples, you start with the words and images from the ones who fought them. The inscriptions here and in other records, like the Great Harris Papyrus, they give us the names, the tribes that made up this confederation. The Peleset, most think they later settled, became the Philistines of the Bible. The Tjeka and the Shekelesh, the Denyen, possibly connected to the Greek Danaoi from Homer, and the Weshesh, a group so obscure their name is almost all we know. Those are the names from the Egyptian side. That's the first clue. Earlier, under Pharaoh Merneptah, a stele boasts of a victory over a Libyan invasion. And in that text, it mentions that among the Libyan allies were foreigners from the north, peoples of the sea. That's the first time the term appears in writing. But you have to read these sources with clear eyes. Ancient Egyptian texts weren't neutral history, they were state propaganda. Every battle is a divine victory for the pharaoh. Every enemy is a chaotic force defeated by the god-king who maintains balance. Mat. So when these texts meant to glorify a decisive Egyptian triumph, when they describe waves of invaders, scenes of unprecedented devastation, you have to pause. If the victors, the ones writing the history, portray an event as a cataclysm that nearly broke the world, what does that say about the true scale of the disaster? For everyone else, the carvings at Medinet Habu are a starting point, a view through a single, triumphant keyhole. They show the storm from inside the only shelter that remained standing. The carvings are one clue, but to find the truth, you have to leave the propaganda and walk through the ruins. The second clue comes from the ground. It's more haunting, maybe. It's the archaeological carnage left across the whole eastern Mediterranean. This evidence isn't written in ink or carved in stone. It's written in ash and fire. You see it at Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. One day it's a bustling center, the heart of a superpower. The next, its gates were sealed from the inside. Palaces and temples were set on fire, a final, desperate act. The city wasn't just conquered, it was ritually closed, abandoned to the wind. Its people just vanished. You see it at Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the coast of Syria. Archaeologists found a kiln there, inside a clay tablet, baked and preserved by the very fire that destroyed the city. It was a frantic letter from the king, a plea for help to an ally. He writes that enemy ships have been sighted, that his forces are away, that the city is defenseless. The letter was never sent, the kiln was its tomb, and Ugarit was reduced to a layer of blackened debris, and you see it across the Mycenaean world, in places like Pylos. Grand palaces with frescoes, storerooms full of goods, they were violently sacked and burned. The intricate bureaucracy that ran them, recorded on clay tablets in a script called Linear B, fell silent. The writing just stops. This is the pattern, from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant. A line of destruction appears in the archaeological record, all around the same time. A horizon of fire, it speaks of a catastrophe that was swift, violent, and total. It wasn't just a war, it was the end of a way of life. This physical evidence has led to a broader theory. One that looks beyond a simple invasion. They call it a systems collapse. Think of that Bronze Age world not as a row of dominoes, but as a complex machine. Every part relied on every other part. Trade networks brought in tin and copper. Palaces redistributed grain. Scribes managed it all. Now imagine multiple stresses hitting that machine at once. Evidence suggests a period of severe drought, poor harvests that would strain food supplies, cause unrest. Earthquakes may have damaged key cities, and the trade that created wealth could spread instability. If one kingdom faltered, its partners felt the shock. So when the record shows the sudden end of Linear B writing, it means the palace bureaucracy collapsed. When specific pottery styles disappear, it means the specialized craftsmen are gone. The trade routes are gone. The machine wasn't just broken, it was taken apart. This is where the story of the Sea Peoples deepens. Were they the sole cause, a mysterious hurricane from the sea, or were they a product of it? Maybe they were a mix. Displaced peoples, refugees from failing states, opportunistic raiders, moving into a power vacuum created by a world already buckling under its own strains. Their attacks may have been the final blow, devastating to a system already on the brink, the fire that consumed a house already filled with smoke. The modern study of archaeology really started with this question of who they were. In the late 1800s, scholars finally read the Egyptian hieroglyphs. They found names: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shurden. It was like a list of suspects from an ancient case. And right away, they tried to match these names to places we know from later history. The Peleset seemed to connect to the Philistines. The Shekelesh might link to Sicily. The Shurden to Sardinia. It was a powerful idea that you could hear echoes of the ancient map in these names. But after a century of work, we've learned to be careful. The first thing to know is that the Sea Peoples almost certainly weren't one nation. They weren't a unified army from one place under one king. Everything in the records points to a confederation. A temporary alliance, different groups, each with their own name, their own origin. It's less like an invading country and more like a storm gathering, pulling winds from many different directions. So where did those winds start? Theories point everywhere. Some groups, like the Lucca from Hittite texts, are tied to Lycia in Anatolia, a place known for sailors and sometimes pirates. The Shurden, with those horned helmets in Egyptian carvings, might have a link to Sardinia, because later bronze figures there wear similar helmets, and the Peleset, after they were defeated, were settled by Egypt in Canaan. Their pottery and architecture show strong Aegean influence, but this is where it gets complicated. This is where historians like Eric Klein say we need to slow down. A name traveling doesn't mean a whole people migrated. We see Shurden warriors in Egyptian art centuries before the collapse. Some of these groups were already working as mercenaries. So maybe the Sea Peoples event wasn't a sudden invasion from the outside. Maybe it was a violent realignment of people already inside the system, groups displaced by famine or unrest, turning on their employers and neighbors. The language links are tempting, but they aren't proof. Calling a group after an island doesn't mean they came from there originally. It could be where they ended up. Or just what others called them. The archaeology is fuzzy too. That Aegean-style pottery in Philistine cities. It could mean settlers from the Aegean. Or it could mean local potters copying a new style brought by a small elite group. We don't have a smoking gun, no sunken fleet with a cargo that says where it's from. No mass grave of warriors with clearly foreign gear. The Sea Peoples slip through the cracks. They're defined more by their effect, that horizon of fire, than by any untouched homeland. And that ambiguity might be the most important clue. It suggests they weren't outside destroyers. They were a symptom of the collapse itself. A chaotic mix of refugees and mercenaries and opportunists coming out of the broken pieces of the Bronze Age world. There's another way to look at those carvings at Medinet Habu, not as a battle against an army, but as a defense against a tide. That's the migrant wave idea. The Sea Peoples weren't just raiders, they were refugees, whole populations moving, driven from their homes by something they couldn't control. The scale of that. Not a fleet of warships, but a flotilla for survival. Families crammed onto anything that floated, ox carts loaded with whatever was left, all pushing slowly, relentlessly, toward the places that still had food. Toward Egypt. What could make that many people leave? Climate science gives an answer. Studies of ancient pollen, sediment, tree rings. They show a long, severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean right when everything collapsed. Not a bad season, a mega-drought, decades long. This was a catastrophe. Crops failing year after year, springs and rivers drying up. The palace systems that stored grain, they'd buckle. Famine would spread, and when people can't feed their children, they move, they get desperate. Think of that desperation as a weapon. A soldier fights for pay. A refugee fights for a future, for land where their family might not starve. That's a different ferocity. It's total. This wave wouldn't fight by the rules of chariot battles. They would swarm, overwhelmed by numbers and by need. The Egyptian records hint at this. They describe fighting warriors, but also their wives and children and wagons. This wasn't a military campaign. It was a migration in arms, so the Sea Peoples become less an invading nation and more a human tsunami, a force of nature made of people. They were likely a chaotic mix, groups from Anatolia, the Aegean, maybe Italy, all pushed south and east by the same pressure, not united by culture or language. United by crisis, as they moved, they hit the weakened states of that collapsing world. A starving, armed population entering a region already suffering from drought and failing governments. The result was a chain reaction, violence, societal failure. They were both a cause of the collapse and a product of it, a final symptom of a world breaking apart under the weight of a changing climate. This view doesn't excuse the devastation, but it reframes it. It moves the story from villains and victims to something more tragic, a human story of survival in a crumbling world. There's another image that stays with us, freedom and terror on the open water, the pirate. That's the fourth lens for the Sea Peoples, not as refugees. As opportunists, a confederation of maritime raiders, you have to picture the Mediterranean differently, not as a highway for trade, as a lawless frontier. The great empires that once policed the seas, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, they're gone. Their navies are wreckage, and in that sudden silence, the only power belongs to whoever has the fastest ship. The sharpest sword. This theory says the Sea Peoples were just that, professional warriors of the sea, not a nation on the move, a coalition of the ambitious. The evidence is subtle, but it's there. We know some of these groups were already inside the system, long before everything fell apart. Egyptian records from the time of Ramesses II, almost a century earlier, mention Sheridan warriors. They served as his personal bodyguards. They were elite mercenaries, so these weren't unknown foreigners from some distant shore. They were part of the military fabric of the age. But then, what changed? The central palaces fell. Payments in silver or grain stopped, and a mercenary's loyalty evaporates. A soldier with no employer and a ship, that's a pirate by definition. It's easy to see these professional fighters cut loose, banding together for greater profit. They would know the trade routes, the weak coastal cities, the layout of the very palaces they might have once defended. This model answers a practical question. The migrant wave theory struggles with it, coordination. Mounting a large-scale raid across the open sea is a massive logistical feat. It requires navigation, supply, ship-to-ship communication. Refugees fleeing a drought might manage a desperate coastal crawl. But to strike with the precision and force described at Ugarit, that suggests something else. It suggests seasoned sailors, veterans who knew how to work together, even loosely. A pirate confederation isn't a unified army with a single king. It's a temporary alliance of captains, each with their own crew and goals, agreeing to sail together for a season because the target is too rich to take alone. So you have this mix. The superpower navies vanish, creating a vacuum. Skilled maritime mercenaries find themselves unemployed, and the richest cities in the world are suddenly, tragically, undefended. The coastal centers of trade, packed with wealth from centuries of commerce, become the perfect target, and the raids wouldn't just be for plunder, they would be systemic sabotage. By burning the ports and the ships, these raiders weren't just taking treasure, they were severing the very arteries of the Bronze Age world, ensuring it could never recover. That leads to a darker vision of the collapse, more calculated. It wasn't just a natural disaster or a blind human tide. It was a targeted dismantling by those who understood how the machine worked and saw a chance to take it apart for their own gain. It adds a layer of agency to the chaos, a chilling one. So we have to ask, could a loose alliance of pirates truly bring down Bronze Age superpowers? Or is it more likely they were the final, decisive blow, a spark thrown onto a pile of timber that was already bone dry and splintered from within? The truth might live in that space. Between accident and intention, where desperation meets opportunity on a darkening sea, the Hittite Empire was a superpower. It ruled for centuries from Hattusa, this sprawling city of temples and palaces up in the Anatolian highlands. They were Egypt's great rival and equal at the bargaining table. Kings exchanged letters, sealed marriages, fought that famous battle at Kadesh. Then around 1200 BC, it was just gone. Not conquered, erased, Hattusa's gates were sealed from the inside. Its buildings were burned in a final, systematic act. Their language, written in cuneiform on all those clay tablets, fell silent. It would stay unreadable for over 3,000 years. The disappearance sent a shockwave through the entire system. It wasn't just an empire falling. It was a pillar of the international order collapsing. With Hattusa gone, a vast territory was suddenly lawless. Trade routes to the north and east were severed. And a whole population of soldiers, administrators, craftsmen were set adrift, adding to this growing tide of the displaced. That shock traveled south along the trade routes to the wealthy coastal cities of the Levant. Ugarit was one of the jewels, a bustling port, a hub where goods from Cyprus, Anatolia, and Egypt all flowed through. Its last king, Amurapi, saw the storm gathering. Archaeologists found his final plea for help, a clay tablet baked hard in the fire that consumed his city. He wrote to the king of Elashia on Cyprus, begging for support. Enemy ships, he reported, had already burned towns along the coast. His own troops and ships were far away, he said, and the city was left defenseless. The reply, if there was one, never arrived. Ugarit was sacked and burned so completely it was never rebuilt. So the economic arteries of the Bronze Age were cut, one by one. With each port city that fell, the complex web of exchange that fed the great powers grew weaker. Tin couldn't reach copper. Luxury goods couldn't reach palaces. The system was bleeding out. Across the sea, in the Aegean, a similar darkness fell. The Mycenaean world with its fortress palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, Turin. This was the Greek precursor to classical glory. These were the centers of Homer's legends, ruled by wanaks, kings who controlled vast storerooms and a bureaucracy that tracked everything on clay tablets in a script called Linear B. Then the fires came. Palace after palace was violently destroyed, reduced to layers of ash and collapsed stone. The writing stops. The whole system for redistributing goods, olive oil, pottery, textiles, it just vanishes. The population plummets. What followed were centuries called the Greek Dark Ages, a time of poverty, isolation, lost knowledge. The art of writing was forgotten. Grand architecture ceased. People retreated to small, fortified villages. The cultural memory of that palatial age survived only in epic poetry, a faded echo. This was the domino effect in its most devastating form. It wasn't a single battle lost. It was a cascade of failures, each collapse making the next one more inevitable. The Hittite fall created a power vacuum and a refugee crisis. The destruction of the Levantine ports strangled commerce. The implosion of the Mycenaean palaces removed another major player. Each fallen civilization was a node in the network, and as each node went dark, the entire system grew dimmer until finally the lights went out almost everywhere. Only Egypt, battered and diminished, managed to keep a flicker alive. The sea peoples moved through this landscape of unraveling order. They were both a cause of individual disasters and a symptom of the larger collapse. Their impact reshaped the cultural and political map forever, wiping away centuries of progress and setting the stage for a new, very different world to emerge from the ashes. The last line of defense was the Nile Delta, a reedy marsh. After 2,000 years, Egypt was alone. Every other great power had fallen into ruin, but Egypt endured. That wasn't just luck, it was geography, a powerful central state, and an economic insulation no one else had. And seeing why Egypt survived shows you the scale of the disaster everywhere else. Geography was the first shield. The Nile River was a natural fortress. An invading force, especially by sea, had to navigate the delta's shifting channels. They couldn't just land anywhere. They were funneled toward predictable points, and there, waiting, was a state still strong enough to mount a defense. That's what you see at Medinet Habu. Egyptian archers on the shore in ships, unleashing arrows into crowded enemy vessels before they could land. A brutal tactic. They turned their home ground into a killing field. Now contrast that with the Hittite and Mycenaean worlds. Their power was spread across rugged, mountainous terrain. The Hittite capital was inland, but its empire was a patchwork connected by vulnerable roads. The Mycenaean palaces were isolated hilltop fortresses, each ruling its own small region. There was no single, defensible barrier like the Nile. An enemy could strike one palace, then move to the next. That fragmentation was a fatal weakness. Egypt was a narrow, unified strip of life, protected by deserts on both sides and the sea to the north. Its very shape made it easier to defend, but geography means little without the power to use it. That's the second factor, the state itself. Under Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt was still a centralized, bureaucratic monarchy. The palace could command grain from the fields, labor for defenses, and a standing army and navy. Ramesses didn't just react, he prepared. He fortified the delta branches, mobilized every ship, rallied his troops for a battle of survival. The other kingdoms, already weakened by drought and internal strain, couldn't muster that kind of response. Their systems had already cracked. The third pillar was economic. Egypt was insulated by the Nile's predictable floods. While other regions suffered catastrophic drought, the Nile kept bringing its silt. Egypt could still feed itself. That agricultural wealth meant the state's treasury, its ability to pay soldiers and workers, remained intact long after other palaces' storerooms were empty. Expert analysis points to this as the decisive difference. Egypt wasn't just fighting off invaders, it was fighting from a position of relative stability, with a full stomach and a functioning economy. The others were trying to fight while their foundations crumbled beneath them. Egypt's survival came at a terrible cost. The kingdom was battered, impoverished. It would never regain its former imperial glory. The age of pharaohs as superpower players was over, but by enduring, Egypt performed a service for history. It preserved the records, the carvings at Medinet Habu, the papyrus scrolls, the administrative texts they survived. Because Egypt stood, we have a primary window into the catastrophe. We hear about the collapse not just from silent ashes, but from the voice of the last civilization left standing, describing the storm that took all the others. That continuity of culture and record-keeping makes Egypt our most important guide to understanding what was lost. Goliath of Gath, that giant in bronze. He was a Philistine, and in the Bible that name means the coastal enemy of the Israelites. But that conflict, it hides a deeper origin, because the Philistines, most scholars agree, were the Peleset. One of the tribes named in the Egyptian records, part of the Sea Peoples, and their journey has this dramatic twist. They didn't vanish after fighting Egypt. They settled, they built a new life, they went from invaders to settlers, from a mysterious force to a people with a name, a culture, a place in history. That pivot is recorded at Medinet Habu. After his victories, Pharaoh Ramesses III didn't send the Peleset away. He resettled them in the strategic coastal cities of Canaan. The southern Levant, it was imperial strategy. Use a defeated, skilled population to garrison a troublesome frontier, a decision that reshaped the region for centuries. So you have this rare, clear line, from the chaotic lists of sea peoples on temple walls to a specific, visible culture in the biblical lands. The archaeology at Philistine sites, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, it's unmistakable. In the layers just after the Bronze Age collapse, something new appears. A distinct style of pottery, completely different from local Canaanite wares. decorated with bold, spiraling designs, red and black geometric patterns. To experts, that pottery screams Aegean influence. It looks like it's from the world of the fallen Mycenaean palaces. And alongside that, changes in what people ate. These new settlers had a taste for pork, which their Canaanite neighbors largely avoided. Even their architecture shifted. New styles of hearths, new building layouts. For a few generations, this Philistine culture remained strikingly foreign, an island of Aegean tradition on the Canaanite coast. But then something predictable began to happen: assimilation. Over the next 2 or 3 centuries, that distinct pottery slowly changed. The bold Mycenaean motifs softened, blended with local Canaanite designs, eventually became indistinguishable. The Philistines began to worship local gods, Dagon, Asherah, alongside any deities they brought with them. They adopted the Canaanite language and script. They became, for all intents and purposes, part of the fabric of the region, yet they kept their unique political identity. A powerful confederation of city-states, the rivals of Kings Saul and David. That transformation forces a question about identity. How does a group labeled as oceanic destroyers become farmers, potters, city dwellers? The Philistine enigma shows the sea peoples not as a mindless force but as complex human communities. They were warriors, but they were also families carrying their cooking pots, their weaving techniques, their aesthetic tastes. People displaced by a collapsing world who seized a chance for stability when Egypt offered it, however reluctantly. Their story is resilience and adaptation. It provides the clearest archaeological bridge between the shadowy invaders of the collapse and a historically attested civilization. In the Philistines, you don't just see the end of the Bronze Age. You see the messy, complicated birth of the Iron Age world. They were looking for land, resources, somewhere to survive. These are the oldest reasons for anything, and they help explain the sea peoples. We have to get past calling them destroyers and ask what they were after. Were they trying to conquer, or were they trying to find a home? The evidence doesn't give one answer. It gives two, and that's the point. You look at what they left behind. Some cities, like Hattusa, were burned and then left empty for hundreds of years. That's erasure, but then other places, the cities that became Philistine, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, those were taken violently, but then they were rebuilt. And not just repaired, they were rebuilt with a new culture, new pottery, new food, new ways of building. That's not pillaging, that's settlement. That's people moving in to stay. So you have two models in history. One is like the Vikings, raiders from the sea, hitting coasts for treasure, for slaves, for goods, and then sailing back home. Their goal was plunder, not land. The other model is the Germanic migrations, whole communities with families and all their possessions moving into a weakening empire. Their goal was land, a place to farm, a future, and the sea peoples, they seemed to be both. Some parts of them were probably like Viking raiders, fighters taking advantage of chaos to get rich. But most of the evidence, from the Egyptian carvings showing ox carts to those settled Philistine cities, points to the other thing. The heart of this was a migration. A desperate, armed search for a new homeland. That changes how you see the violence. It was still devastating, but it becomes more understandable. If you're an entire people on the move, pushed out by drought and famine back home, you're not fighting for glory. You're fighting to live. The cities in your way aren't just targets. They're either obstacles or they're potential new homes. If a city fights back, you might destroy it. If it falls easily, or if the land is good, you might take it over. You rebuild it your way. The motive isn't just destruction anymore, it's acquisition. So they weren't some mysterious evil force. They were probably a mix: displaced farmers from Anatolia, where the rain stopped, mercenaries with no work after the Mycenaean palaces fell, sailors from the Aegean whose trade had collapsed, thrown together by circumstance into a desperate alliance, moving toward the last stable places with food, the Nile Delta, the coast of Canaan. What they did was catastrophic, but the force behind it was human. The need for security, for a place to plant crops, to raise children. That doesn't excuse the collapse they helped cause. But it takes away the myth. It puts them inside the human drama of a world falling apart, where the struggle for basics could redraw maps and wipe empires from history. The world might have turned against them, and we focus on kings and warriors, but the real power here could have been the climate. There's this science now, paleoclimatology. It reads a different record, not in stone but in mud, in pollen, in the rings of old trees, and the story it tells is stark. Around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean hit a drought. A long one, severe. This wasn't just a few bad years, it was a mega-drought, decades long, maybe centuries. The evidence is all over. Scientists drill cores from lake bottoms. They look at the sediment layers year by year like pages, and in those layers there's pollen, these tiny, durable signs of what was growing. And right at this time, the pollen from dry, drought-resistant plants shoots up. The pollen from lush trees, from crops that need water, it just plummets. Tree rings from ancient timber say the same thing, narrow rings, stressed year after year. A profound lack of water. This shift wasn't local. It seems to have been widespread, from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant. The heart of the Bronze Age world was slowly drying up. Experts point to possible triggers, a series of big volcanic eruptions maybe, ash in the atmosphere cooling the planet, disrupting rainfall patterns for years. The whole weather system seems to have shifted, and for a society built on agriculture, the consequences were catastrophic. Think of the chain. First, the rains fail. Then the wheat and barley wither, the harvests shrink year after year. The great palace storerooms, the granaries that were the economy's foundation, they start to empty. The tax system where farmers gave grain to the state, it collapses. There's nothing to give, famine spreads, and when people are hungry, societies fracture. Loyalty to a distant king means little when your children are starving. Peasants leave the land, soldiers desert, local governors rebel, hoarding what little food is left. That whole intricate web of obligations holding the palace economies together, it just unravels. This environmental stress is the crucial context for the human movement we call the Sea Peoples. They might not have been the first cause, they were likely a desperate effect. Communities in Anatolia pushed off parched land, heading toward places that might still have water. Groups from the Aegean, where the drought was just as bad, taking to ships, not for conquest but for survival. The climate didn't wield a sword, but it created the hunger. The displacement, the deep instability that made millions desperate enough to move. And when desperate, armed populations start to migrate, conflict is inevitable. This challenges the old idea, the great man theory of history, where everything is just kings and generals. It suggests a humbling truth. The mightiest empires, with all their chariots and gold, were vulnerable to something they couldn't control. The sky. Their fate was written not just in treaties and battles, but in failing rains, in shrinking rivers. So the story of the Sea Peoples becomes a lesson in interdependence. A reminder that human civilization exists in a delicate balance with the natural world. And when that balance is disturbed, history can be rewritten in fire and ash. Bronze was the metal of kings. It was the metal of empires for centuries. That's what power was. It was an alloy, copper and tin. To make it, you needed a vast trade network, stable and controlled. The great powers controlled it. Their warriors, the elite, fought from chariots, mobile platforms for archers. That was the warfare of the established order. Expensive, hierarchical, but then you look at the carvings at Medinet Habu, the enemies of Egypt. They look different. They're on foot, fighting in dense packs. They carry round shields, not the tall ones. Their swords look longer, straight, made for thrusting, and some have those feathered headdresses. That visual contrast, it raises a question. Could the Sea Peoples have had an edge, a technological edge? The theory centers on iron. By the late Bronze Age, the process was known, smelting iron from ore. But it was difficult, the metal was often brittle. The great empires with their bronze industries, they had no reason to change. But for groups on the margins, for those cut off from the tin trade, iron was a possibility. The ore is common, you can find it in many places. If you could master the technique carburization, adding carbon to make steel, you could get a weapon. Harder than bronze, sharper, could hold an edge longer. The idea is tantalizing that some of them wielded early iron, a single, superior sword type. In the hands of an infantryman, it could break a chariot charge. It could shatter a bronze blade, but the evidence is thin, frustratingly thin. No cache of iron weapons has been definitively linked to them. The Medinet Habu reliefs show swords, but the stone doesn't tell us the metal, and those images are art, not documentary. The feathered headdresses, the round shields, that might just be artistic shorthand. A way to mark the foreigner. We can't take it as a literal uniform, so maybe the innovation wasn't in the metal. Maybe it was in the method. The empires relied on chariots. Chariots need flat, open terrain to be effective. They also need immense support, trained horses, skilled craftsmen, a stable infrastructure. The Sea Peoples, many came from rugged places. Coastal regions, islands, they fought as infantry and as sailors. Their strength was in their ships, which allowed sudden raids, devastating raids on coastal cities. On land, they may have fought in a close order style, a shield wall, something that could withstand chariot tactics or disrupt them. They didn't fight as a formal army. They fought as a swarm, targeting weak points in a system already under strain. So it's a puzzle. Did they win because they had better swords, or did they win because they had nothing left to lose? The relentless energy of migrants fighting for land, for their families' survival, that's a formidable force. It ignores the rules of aristocratic, chariot-based warfare. It fights to the last, a bronze-clad chariot warrior. He's a symbol of a system. An infantryman with a long sword, bronze or iron, fighting on foot for his future. He's an individual. With a desperate stake in the outcome, that shift from the warfare of the palace to the warfare of necessity, that may have been the real revolution. It wasn't just about what was in their hands, it was about what was in their hearts. The old world was defended by professionals, bound to a fading order. The new force was driven by a need so profound it could erase that order from the map. The clash, then, wasn't just of metals, it was of eras. One ending and one brutally beginning. The Mycenaean world ended with a kind of silence. There was a fire at the palace in Pylos, and in that fire, a clay tablet was sitting in a kiln. It baked hard, it became a permanent record, an inventory, chariot wheels, women weavers, offerings for the gods. This was more than a list burning up. It was a language dying, that script linear B. It was how the Mycenaean Greek palaces kept their accounts. It was how they administered things, but it was also their voice. And when those palaces fell, that voice just stopped, everywhere. The scribes who knew how to write it, the people named in those records, they were gone. That loss of language, that might be the deepest part of the collapse. It wasn't only cities burning, it was memory. A similar silence happened across the sea. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, they had their own tradition, written in cuneiform on thousands of clay tablets, law codes, treaties, myths, very detailed ritual texts. Their language was an early Indo-European tongue. It was the voice of an empire, and then it stopped. No more tablets. The knowledge of how to read it, how to write it, it faded away. It was buried in the rubble of their capital for 3,000 years. Then on Cyprus there was another script, Cypro-Minoan, used by Alashia, a wealthy trading center. It also disappears from the record. These scripts, they weren't just writing systems, they were containers. They held a society's identity. tax records, yes, but also prayers. Poetry, legal agreements from daily life. When they vanish, it creates a blackout, a rupture. For Greece, it brought a true dark age. The memory of writing itself was lost. The stories from that time only survived later as echoes, in epic poetry like Homer's Iliad, but stripped of their real context. That silence is what makes the collapse so profound. It makes you see history not just by what was built, but by what was lost completely. The contrast is sharp. In Egypt, hieroglyphs continued. In Mesopotamia, the cuneiform scribes kept working. Their civilizations were shaken, but the cultural thread was never cut. They could tell their own stories. For the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, we only have fragments. We have to piece the story together from archaeology, from the accounts of their enemies, from the silent objects they left behind. We know the Hittites had a vast mythology. Stories about a disappearing god that brought winter, epic battles against a dragon, but we only recovered these tales because modern linguists did the work, deciphering a language that had been mute for millennia. So the end of the Bronze Age was more than a political disaster or a military one. It was a cultural cataclysm. Whole ways of seeing the world, entire administrative systems, unique literary and religious traditions, they were erased. The silence that followed those fires is as telling as the layers of ash. It shows that civilization is a fragile conversation, passed down from one generation to the next in symbols on clay and stone. And when that conversation is violently interrupted, what's lost isn't just treasure or territory. It's a piece of the human story, leaving behind a mystery that only whispers in fragments. The greatest empires might fall from the inside, not from enemies outside, but from something hollowing them out. That brings in a fifth idea, the internal revolt hypothesis. It challenges the whole story of an invasion. It says the Sea Peoples were a fiction, a propaganda tool for Egypt. A way to explain a catastrophe that was really a social revolution, a house falling because its own foundation gave way. Think about those palace economies. They were intensely hierarchical, a king and a small elite at the top in a fortified palace, below them a vast population, farmers, herders, artisans. Their lives were run by the palace. They paid heavy taxes in grain and goods. They gave labor for state projects. Their surplus supported everything. The elite's luxury, the army, the whole system, for centuries it held. But what happens when that contract breaks, when harvests fail and the palace still demands its share? When distant rulers seem indifferent, resentment builds. There's evidence of this strain. Hittite records mention food shortages leading to unrest. They speak of men of hunger. The need to suppress revolts in the provinces. In the Mycenaean world, the Linear B tablets from Pylos show a society on a war footing at the end, but they also show a system straining. Meticulous records of every resource, a desperate attempt to control a dwindling supply. The theory is this pressure finally exploded, not as one peasant revolt, but as a widespread breakdown of loyalty. Peripheral regions, long chafing under central control, may have declared independence. Local militias, perhaps led by disgruntled nobles, turned on the palace. And critically, the professional military classes, the mercenaries hired to protect the palaces, could have switched sides. A Shurden warrior, his pay late, watching his family go hungry while the palace storeroom still had grain. He might decide his loyalty was to the highest bidder or just to survival. From this view, the Sea People's invasions look different. Those groups named by Egypt, the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, might not have been outsiders at all. They could have been a mix, disaffected subjects from the edges of the Hittite realm, unpaid mercenary bands now on their own, allied local Canaanite groups seizing the moment to throw off Egyptian or Hittite influence. The Egyptian carvings showing ox carts and families could then be a displacement of local populations, caught in a civil war, fleeing the fighting. This reframes the collapse. It becomes less a mysterious attack by marauders, more a systemic failure of the social order, a revolution from below, where the people who built and sustained the palaces ultimately turned against them. The fires that burned Ugarit and Hattusa might not have been lit by a foreign torch, but by the hands of their own inhabitants, or neighboring communities they had long oppressed. This theory adds a human layer. It asks us to consider the lived experience of the majority, their names never in royal inscriptions, their hunger, their anger, their breaking point. If true, it means the Sea Peoples were not a cause but a symptom, a label applied by the last superpower to a chaotic, multi-sided civil war it barely understood. A war that ended the age of palaces not with a bang from outside, but with a slow collapse from within. The silence that followed was the shattering of an entire social world. The silence after the fires didn't last. It was the kind of quiet you get after a forest fire, harsh but fertile, and from the ashes of those big, connected empires, something new started to grow. A different world, smaller, more broken up, but also more dynamic. The age of superpowers was finished. What came next was a patchwork, regional kingdoms. City-states, the Phoenicians on the coast of what's now Lebanon, the Israelites and Arameans in the hills, some Neo-Hittite states holding on in Anatolia and Syria. These weren't vast empires, they were local powers, independent, often fighting. Their strength wasn't from controlling huge territories, it came from mastering a trade or a craft or a key location. And this new political map came with a major technological shift. The key metal wasn't bronze anymore. Bronze needed a complex, long-distance trade for tin and copper. The new metal was iron. Iron ore is common. You can find it in a lot of places. The knowledge of how to work it, how to smelt it and forge it into tools and weapons, that knowledge spread after the collapse. It was a democratizing force. You didn't need a royal monopoly to get a good plowshare or a strong sword. A local blacksmith with a furnace could make them. That made warfare more accessible. It also made farming more efficient. Iron-tipped plows could break tougher ground, opening new land. The tools for life and conflict became more widespread. Power shifted away from the centralized palaces into more hands. The old palace economies were gone, the scribes tracking every jar of oil. What replaced them were societies built on commerce. The Phoenicians became the master traders of the Mediterranean. With no Hittite or Egyptian overlord controlling the seas, they sailed freely. They set up trading posts. Those posts grew into colonies from Cyprus to North Africa to Spain. Their most famous colony was Carthage. They traded in purple dye, glass, cedar wood, silver. But their biggest innovation wasn't a product, it was a system for recording information. The Phoenicians developed an alphabet, a simple set of about 22 letters, each for a consonant sound. It was a complete break from the old systems. Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, those took years to master. This new alphabet was efficient. You could learn it quickly. It was perfect for merchants keeping accounts, for contracts, for everyday use. This script didn't stay with the Phoenicians. The Greeks adopted it. They added vowels. From the Greeks, it went to the Romans and then to us. These very letters came from that new, decentralized, trade-driven world. An innovation of practicality that outlasted empires. So the Bronze Age collapse wasn't a total end. It was a brutal transition. It cleared away an old, rigid order. And in doing that, it created space for experimentation, for new political ideas, for different ways to organize society. The classical world of the Greeks with their city-states and democracy. The maritime network of the Phoenicians, the monotheistic tradition of Israel, these defining features of the ancient world, they all took root in the soil left by the collapse. The old giants had to fall so these new saplings could find the light. You remember a world that ends through stories. The survivors didn't have archaeology. They had myths, legends passed down after the collapse, and in those you might hear an echo of the real event. It's not history, it's something else. A psychological imprint, a trauma encoded in symbols, a way for people to make sense of something unimaginable. Take the Greek tradition. Later Greeks talked about a Dorian invasion. A wave of simpler, warlike people from the north who swept down and overthrew the Mycenaean kingdoms. Historians now doubt a single, unified invasion happened. But the story feels like a cultural memory, a folk explanation for why the grand palaces of their ancestors were just ruins. It preserves the idea of an overwhelming force. A break in time, something that separated the age of heroes from their own age. In Egypt, the trauma was processed differently. They survived, so their myths could be more triumphant. But there are older, deeper stories. The War of the Gods, a cosmic battle where the god Horus fights Set, the god of chaos and foreign lands. That struggle order against disorder, the fertile Nile against the barren desert, it might have taken on new meaning when real chaos came from the sea. The pharaoh's victory over the sea peoples was framed as a replay of this divine battle, a restoration of cosmic balance. Then there are the biblical narratives. The Book of Joshua describes the fall of powerful Canaanite cities, like Hazor. Archaeology shows Hazor was violently destroyed around this time, and then the long conflict with the Philistines. Goliath, that giant from Gath, he embodies a persistent coastal threat. These stories, written centuries later, they crystallize the memory of a long, difficult period. A time of settlement and conflict in the Levant, where new groups like the Philistines carved out a home, but the most powerful echo might be the Trojan War. Homer's epic is set in this very period of collapse. Historians don't believe in a single 10-year siege over a queen, but the story's core elements, a coalition of Greek kings sailing across the sea to attack a wealthy, fortified city in Anatolia, they resonate. Could it be a mythologized memory of the kind of raids that defined the era, of Mycenaean warlords, their own world crumbling, turning to the sea for plunder? The tale is filled with displacement, wandering heroes, the sack of a great city. It captures the spirit of a time when the sea was both a highway and a weapon. These legends aren't facts to be excavated, they're truths to be understood. They show how societies process catastrophic change, how they turn chaos into narrative. The invaders become giants or gods of chaos. The fallen cities become the stuff of epic. The survivors become heroes or the chosen people. You blend these mythological echoes with the ash layers and the temple carvings, and you get a fuller picture, not just of what happened, but of how it felt. The stories give a voice to the silence that followed the fires. They're the map a culture draws after the ground has already shifted. An attempt to chart a landscape of memory where empires once stood. Hattusa and Ugarit, they feel so far away, but they're storied. It echoes the late Bronze Age collapse. It's a case study in systemic risk. What happens when multiple stresses hit a linked world? Our world today is far more connected. Instant communication, intricate supply chains, a financial system that wraps the whole planet, that creates efficiency, wealth, but it also creates pathways for shock, a drought in a breadbasket region. A blocked shipping lane, a network failure, these things ripple outward fast. The historian Joseph Tainter, he studied collapse, complex societies. He saw a pattern. As societies get more complex, they need more energy to solve problems, more administration, more specialization. It works until the returns diminish. The system gets top-heavy, brittle, less able to adapt. The Bronze Age palaces reached that point. When drought and earthquake and unrest hit, the system couldn't bend. It broke, so it makes you think, are our systems more robust or more vulnerable? We have advantages, scientific understanding, global institutions, knowledge. But our interdependence is also a weakness. Take climate change. The Bronze Age mega-drought was natural. Today, we're altering the climate, creating similar stressors. Crop failures, water scarcity, displacement, but on a planetary scale, or economic ties. A financial crisis on one continent can trigger a global recession overnight. A pandemic can halt everything. These aren't invasions by sea peoples, they're systemic shocks moving through the same networks that give us prosperity. The Hittites, their empire was centralized, the capital fell, and the whole structure crumbled. The Phoenician city-states later they were decentralized. If one city had trouble, others carried on. Our world has both. Some systems, like the internet, are resilient, multiple pathways. Others, like some supply chains, are fragile. A single source, a single route. Resilience isn't about higher walls. It's about flexibility, the capacity to pivot, to find other ways when the primary system fails. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The saga of the sea peoples, the collapse they catalyzed. It's not just an archaeological mystery, it's a lesson. In vulnerability and transformation, it asks us to look at our own foundations, to see what stresses are testing the seams, to remember that the greatest civilizations aren't the invincible ones. They're the ones that learn to adapt, that build in buffers, that see interconnection not just as strength, but as a responsibility. The silence after the Bronze Age wasn't permanent. A new world grew from the ashes, different, full of innovation. That might be the most hopeful parallel. It suggests that in collapse there's the seed of something new. The question is what we plant in the soil of our present. A pottery sherd sits in the dust. An archaeologist's brush moves the earth away. To someone else, it's just broken clay. To the researcher, it's part of a story, a clue. Looking for the sea peoples isn't just reading inscriptions, it's detective work, fragment by fragment. Using tools the pharaohs never imagined, modern archaeology is a puzzle with many pieces. It brings together historians, chemists, geologists, even people who work with satellites. Each one adds something, turning whispers from the past into something clearer. There's a powerful new tool now. It doesn't look at objects, it looks at people. Isotopic analysis. It reads the chemical signatures in human tooth enamel. When you're a child, the minerals in your water and food leave a mark in your teeth. A geographic fingerprint, so scientists can take teeth from a burial site and find out where that person grew up. Imagine a warrior's remains in a destroyed city. You might think he was a local defender, but the isotopes could show his childhood was hundreds of miles away. Maybe Anatolia, maybe the Aegean. That changes a skeleton from a statistic into a biography. It's direct evidence of people moving in that turbulent time. Then there's the view from above. Technologies like LiDAR. It uses lasers to map the ground through forest canopy. In Greece or Anatolia, it can show the outlines of forgotten settlements, roads, fortifications you can't see with your eyes. It shows not just the palaces that fell, but the whole landscape around them. The population density, the trade routes, how people used the land before everything collapsed. It gives you the full stage before the curtain fell. Some of the clearest evidence is underwater. Underwater archaeology gives us a snapshot of Bronze Age trade. The Uluburun shipwreck off Turkey. It sank around 1300 BC, just decades before the collapse. It was a floating warehouse. Its cargo had 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere far, likely Afghanistan, glass from Mesopotamia, ebony from Egypt, amber from the Baltic, Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite jewelry, personal items from 7 different cultures. That one ship is a microcosm. It shows the scale of late Bronze Age globalization. The ship was probably Canaanite or Cypriot, but the crew was international. Their last voyage captures the world that was about to fracture. On land, the work is slow. Excavating a destruction layer is like reading a violent event frozen in time. They map where every artifact lies. They look at how stones fell to gauge the force. They study ash color to understand the fire. A scatter of bronze arrowheads in a street might trace a last stand. Jewelry hidden under a floor, never retrieved, speaks of panic. Sudden flight, these are moments of human drama recovered grain by grain. The detective work never ends. Each digging season, each new technology can overturn an old theory. A DNA study of Philistine remains at Ashkelon showed a genetic influx from southern Europe right when they settled. That's hard data. It supports the idea the Peleset came from across the sea. It's a convergence, myth, historical text, and now genetic evidence. The Sea People's story isn't set in stone. It's written in clay, in bronze, in isotopes and DNA. It's a story we're still uncovering. Its chapters get revised with every trowel of earth, every laser scan. This process demystifies history. The past isn't a fixed tale in a book. It's a living puzzle built from fragments, interpreted through science, connected by curiosity. Our understanding of that collapse and the mysterious people in it changes with each new clue brushed clean. The idea of a single, mysterious race of super-destroyers, that's a modern fiction. The Sea Peoples weren't a genetically pure nation. They didn't sail out with some unknown, superior technology to wipe the slate clean. That image collapses under the evidence. They were a confederation, a mix of groups, different origins, united more by circumstance than by blood. Their weapons and ships were of their time. Bronze and wood, not some lost science. The carvings at Medinet Habu show their vessels were similar to others from the period. Their infantry fought with the spear, the sword, the shield, common across the Mediterranean. There was no secret weapon, no technological leap that explains their impact. Their power came from numbers, from desperation, and from striking a world whose foundations were already cracking. Another myth paints them as the sole cause of the Bronze Age collapse that ignores the intricate web of crises. In some places, like the coastal cities of the Levant, their attacks were likely the final blow. But for the Hittite Empire, deep in Anatolia, the primary causes were probably internal. Famine, rebellion, the failure of the central state long before any seaborne raider could reach their capital. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces show signs of internal conflict, economic strain prior to their burning. To blame the Sea Peoples for everything is to oversimplify a symphony of disaster into a single note. They were a major accelerant, but not the only spark in a tinderbox world. Then there's the grandest fantasy, the link to Atlantis. Since Plato's allegorical tale, there's been a temptation to pin the legend to a real historical catastrophe. The spectacular, simultaneous fall of Bronze Age civilizations seems a perfect candidate. Some have speculated the Sea Peoples were refugees from a lost island empire. But credible archaeology offers no support. There's no evidence of a sophisticated Atlantic civilization that fits Plato's description being destroyed at this time. The theory often relies on circular logic, using the mystery of the Sea Peoples to explain Atlantis, and then using Atlantis to explain the Sea Peoples. It tells us more about our own desire for romantic, single-answer myths than about the past. The true story of climate stress, systemic failure, and human migration is complex. Human scale, it doesn't require a sunken continent to be compelling. Separating these layers, the scholarly theories from the sensational fiction, that's crucial. It isn't about making the past less interesting. It's about honoring its true, complicated nature. The real mystery of the Sea Peoples isn't who they were in some absolute mythical sense. The mystery is how ordinary people, caught in an extraordinary crisis, became the agents of a world's end and a new world's painful birth. That story, built from pottery shards, temple inscriptions, isotopic data, that story is far more profound than any fantasy of ancient super races. It challenges us to see history not as a simple tale of villains and victims, but as a fragile, interconnected human system, where cause and effect are woven as tightly as the threads of a sail. We know the general shape of what happened with the Sea Peoples, but the specifics, the details, those are still missing. The most honest thing we can say is how much we don't know. That mystery isn't a failure. It's just the natural edge of a puzzle that's 3,000 years old, and the questions left are as interesting as any answers we have. First, the order of events. Did it all happen at once? A single, coordinated wave of movement and violence? Or was it a slower crisis over decades with people moving in fits and starts? The destruction layers in the ground across different regions. They seem close in time, but pinning them down to a specific decade is very hard. Was Ugarit destroyed before Hattusa was abandoned? Did the raids in Greece cause the migrations toward Egypt, or was it the other way around? Trying to sort that chronology is like trying to figure out the order of dominoes falling from the sound of a single crash. Then the migration itself. The Egyptian carvings show a mix, warriors and families, but were they all part of one big, desperate exodus, or were there separate groups, each with their own reasons and timing? Some scholars see a first wave, maybe more like pirates, hitting the coasts, then a second, larger wave of migrants with their possessions coming after. The evidence is too broken to say for sure. We see the before, we see the after. The collapse itself is just a blur of motion and fire. Maybe the most personal unknown is their language. What did they speak around their campfires, on their ships? We have the names. Egypt gave them Peleset, Tjeka, Denyon, but those are labels from the outside. We have no inscriptions from the Sea Peoples themselves, no treaties, no prayers, no casual notes. If they wrote, it was on something perishable that didn't survive, or in a script we don't recognize. Their voice is the great silence in this story. Without it, we can only guess at their stories, their songs, what they thought. This leads right to the question of where they came from. We have theories linking names to later places: Sardinia, Sicily, the Aegean. But were those their original homelands, or just places they ended up? Did the Sheridan come from Sardinia, or did they give their name to it later? Looking for one single lost homeland is probably pointless. They likely came from many places, but the idea persists. Could there be a key settlement, a staging ground still undiscovered? Maybe buried under river silt or on a coastal plain now underwater since the Bronze Age. Every new underwater survey off Anatolia or Israel has that potential. These aren't just academic riddles, they force us to face the limits of what we can know about the past. How do you reconstruct a history where the main actors left no written record? We rely on the accounts of their enemies who had every reason to caricature them. We rely on physical objects which can tell us what people did, but rarely why they did it. The story of the Sea Peoples is a lesson in working with incomplete evidence. It teaches humility, and it makes every new discovery a shipwreck, a genetic study, a translated text, a possible key to a lock we didn't even know was there. This ongoing search is what makes history a living field. It's not a closed book of facts. It's a conversation across thousands of years. The biggest legacy of these mysterious peoples might not be the empires they helped bring down, but the deep questions they make us ask. About how civilizations end, about how identity forms in chaos, and about how fragile the evidence is that connects us to the human past. The mystery stays. Not as a failure, but as an invitation. The story of the Sea Peoples has left the history books behind. It's in the games we play now, the things we read. They've turned into a kind of modern myth. We fill in the blanks ourselves. In a game like Total War, Pharaoh, you face them. They come in the late stages like a catastrophe. An unstoppable wave of elite soldiers moving across the map. Or in Age of Empires, you guide their migration. A civilization built on ships, on constant movement. In these worlds, they're the final challenge, a force of nature but with statistics. Their main feature is the threat. Their mystery is the key attribute. That portrayal leans into the enigma. They become the faceless horde from the ocean. It's a narrative shortcut. It's exciting, but it loses the human reality. The drought, the displacement, the desperation. This repurposing goes beyond games. Novelists build whole sagas around them, epic historical fiction, or fantasies where they're survivors from Atlantis. Documentaries use dramatic narration, CGI. They frame it as an ancient apocalypse. The visuals are dark ships, stormy skies, cities burning. The focus is on the fear they caused. The scale of the destruction, that storytelling has a purpose. It takes an archaeological puzzle and makes it visceral, emotional. We're not just studying pottery changes. We're watching a world end that taps into a fascination, a deep human interest in collapse, how civilizations, even great ones, can disappear, but there's a trade-off. Nuance is usually the first thing to go. The complex theories, systemic collapse, climate change, internal revolt, they get flattened. It becomes a simple story. Invaders against the civilized, the sea peoples become a single they, a convenient villain for the drama that risks locking in a popular understanding. One that's far behind what academics discuss. Still, even in simplifying, these stories do something vital. They introduce millions to a turning point. A forgotten pivot in history. They spark a first curiosity that might lead someone to dig deeper beyond the game or the novel into the actual debates among scholars. Maybe the most telling thing is the term itself, sea peoples. It's drifted into our modern language as a metaphor. You might see it in political commentary, describing a sudden, chaotic migration crisis, or in an environmental article about climate refugees. It's become a shorthand for any overwhelming, inexplicable external force. Something that challenges a stable order. That usage shows how we use the past to make sense of the present. We see unsettling patterns, coastal threats, systems failing, mass movements of people, and we reach for a historical analogy. The sea peoples, because their origins are blurred, become a perfect symbol. They can stand in for our own anxieties about borders, resources, the fragility of our interconnected world. This journey from academic mystery to pop culture to metaphor, it tells us less about 1200 BCE. It tells us more about ourselves. It shows why this historical blank spot is so fertile. We're drawn to unsolved puzzles. We're compelled by apocalyptic tales that carry a warning, and we instinctively use the shadows of the past to give shape to the uncertainties of the present. The sea peoples endure not because we've solved them. They endure because their story is a mirror. It reflects our perennial fears about what happens when the world we know is swept away. By a rising, unknown tide, the camp is quiet before dawn. Wood smoke and the smell of drying fish, that scent, it's on so many shores. A woman sits by a low fire. Her fingers trace a spiral pattern on a broken pot. The clay is local, but the design, that's from a memory, from a home across the sea where the rain stopped. She mixes resin to mend it. Her movements are practiced. This pot will hold grain or water for the journey ahead. It's a small act of preservation. In a world coming apart, nearby, a man works on his sword. It's not a royal weapon, it's his own, a Nor-Roman II type, long, straight blade for thrusting. He sharpens it slowly on a whetstone. That rhythmic scrape is a familiar sound in the camp. The bronze gleams dully in the firelight. He thinks of the last time he used it. Not in a grand battle, it was a desperate scramble on a foreign beach. He was a hired shield once, for a king whose name he's forgotten. Now the sword is for his family. Packed into the ox cart behind him, with a few clay lamps and bronze tools they still own, the camp itself is a temporary mosaic. You hear different tongues. A prayer to a storm god from the Anatolian highlands, a curse in Mycenaean Greek, the laughter of children chasing a dog between the tents and the beached ships. That's a universal sound. The faces around the fires are a map, sun-weathered features from the Levantine coast, lighter skin and hair from the Aegean islands. The distinctive tattoos of a Lucca sailor from the Lycian shore. They are not one people, they are a gathering, bound not by blood but by a shared language of loss. And the urgent need for what comes next, a council of sorts, is happening by the largest ship, not a king and his nobles. It's a group, men and a few women who have emerged as leaders. One is a former mercenary captain, his authority earned in a dozen fights. Another is a village elder. Her wisdom is in reading weather and storing food. They speak in a broken mix of words and hand signals, debating the wind, the reports from scouts, the dwindling supplies. Theirs is a fragile, practical alliance. There's no grand plan to erase empires. The debate is about the next bay, the next river valley, whether the people in the stone-walled city a day's sail from here will trade for food, or if they will fight. This is the human reality behind the term Sea Peoples. It's not a unified army on the march, it's a community in transit. In this camp, you see the archaeological clues given life. Aegean-style pottery used alongside Canaanite storage jars. Those distinctive swords maintained not for conquest but for defense. The ox carts, the ones visible in Egyptian carvings, here being loaded with sleeping mats and sacks of milled barley. The anxiety is palpable, a tightness in the shoulders of the lookouts staring out to sea, but so is the determination, that stubborn focus on the immediate tasks. Mending a sail, feeding a child, deciding which cherished, heavy thing must be left behind to lighten the load. To walk through this camp is to replace an abstract invading force with individuals. A young father teaching his son to tie a knot, an old woman whispering the names of ancestors into the smoke, a teenage girl adjusting a fibula brooch that held her mother's cloak. They carry their cultures with them in these small, material ways. Their hope is not for dominion, it's for stability, for a patch of earth that will not turn to dust, for a coast where they can beach their ships for the last time. This reconstruction is an informed imagination. We cannot know their conversations, but the objects they left behind in ashes and in settlements tell a story. Movement, mixture, and a profound human will to endure. It's a reminder. History's great tides are made of countless small, human moments. Most of them are lost to the silence. The Bronze Age empires fell, and if they hadn't, everything would be different. That's path dependency. One chaotic event sets a course. Everything after has to follow that path. The collapse didn't just end things, it cleared the ground. It made certain futures possible, and it closed off others. From that wreckage came the foundations of the classical world. And from that, our own. There was a power vacuum along the Levantine coast. Egyptian and Hittite influence was gone. Local cultures could evolve without an imperial overlord. The Phoenicians stepped into that space. They were master sailors, traders. They built a commercial empire of networks, not territory. Their greatest export was an idea. A simple, accessible alphabet, a script for efficiency in ports and markets. The Greeks adopted it, they adapted it, they added vowels. It became a tool for recording poetry, for philosophy, for law. Mycenaean Linear B was a tool for palace bureaucrats. The Greek alphabet was a tool for citizens. Our own letters descend from that, an innovation born from collapse. In the hills of Canaan, another transformation was taking shape. The Philistines arrived and settled on the coast. That created a persistent military pressure, a cultural pressure. The formation of a united Israelite kingdom under Saul and David was in part a defensive response to that Philistine threat. The struggle for identity in that contested land forged the narratives. Monotheism, covenant, ideas that would shape Western religious thought. If the Bronze Age order had persisted, with Egyptian garrisons and Hittite treaties firmly in place, those conditions might never have emerged. That cultural flowering might not have happened. Then there's Greece itself. The Mycenaean collapse plunged the region into a dark age, centuries long. Palaces vanished, writing vanished, monumental art vanished, but from that simplified, fragmented society, something new was rebuilt, not from the top down. From the ground up, the classical polis emerged, the city-state, smaller, more participatory, fiercely independent. The values of that world debate, civic duty, individual excellence, they were products of a long, hard recovery. They were answers to questions the palace bureaucrats never had to ask. Homer's epic poetry preserved a garbled memory of the lost age, but the society that cherished those poems was fundamentally different. It was born from the necessity of starting over. The Iron Age world wasn't a diminished version of the Bronze Age. It was a reorganization. Power shifted. From sprawling, hierarchical empires to nimble, networked city-states and regional kingdoms, warfare moved from the chariot aristocrat to the citizen hoplite. Writing moved from the palace scribe to the merchant and the poet. This wasn't a decline. It was a diversification of power, of culture, of innovation. In this view, the Sea Peoples become accidental revolutionaries. Whether they were desperate migrants or opportunistic raiders, their actions helped break a mold. They toppled a system that, for all its grandeur, had grown rigid. The collapse was a historical reset, brutal and traumatic, but it created space for experiments. Experiments that defined the next millennium. The classical world, with all its flaws and glories, was forged in that disaster. Their forgotten saga isn't just a mystery of the past. It's the story of a fracture, the fracture through which our own world began to dawn. The fire on the horizon wasn't the end, it was a start. We've crossed this whole sea of evidence. Temple carvings, tree rings, sunken ships, isotopes in old teeth. We've watched theories come and go, the desperate migrants, the pirates looking for an opening. The idea of a climate disaster, the truth is probably somewhere in the rough water between all of those. The Sea Peoples weren't just one nation of destroyers. It was a complicated human event. They were a cause of that perfect storm that ended an age, and also a consequence of it. Their real names, their homes, that's lost. 3,000 years of silence, but their impact is still here, carved into the world that came next. They were the shock that helped clear the ground. That made space for the Phoenician traders, the Greek city-states, the kingdoms in the Levant you read about in the Bible. The classical world was forged in that aftermath. And so, in a way, our world was too. This mystery, it's more than a puzzle for historians. It's a mirror. It shows how fragile even the brightest civilizations can be. All those networks of trade and trust, they can come apart so fast, but it shows resilience too, the way people can adapt, move, rebuild from the ashes. So the story of the Sea Peoples is really a story of change. It reminds you that an ending is often just a brutal, messy start for something else.